Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Earth Day Everyday podcast, where we aim to spotlight exemplary activists, policymakers, and change makers in the field of sustainability and climate change. I'm your host, Aryan Doshi, and today we are extremely lucky to be joined by Dr. Owens. Dr. Owens is a professor at the University of Hartford, a Fulbright Fellow, artist, and National Geographic explorer, among so many other things. Dr. Owens, it is absolutely amazing to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Yeah, so maybe to get started, can you just talk a little bit more about your journey and what caused you to pursue, environmental science sustainability as a career?
Yeah, so I have always had this sort of interest in the arts. And when I went to college, I went to the College of Charleston in South Carolina for my undergraduate degree. And I was really into art and painting and printmaking. And so I that's what I majored in.
Yeah,
And I loved it. But my topic, or sort of the subject matter that I focused on throughout my time as an art major,
yeah.
was insects and arthropods.
Wow, yeah.
So I was, yeah. So I was
That's
also this bug
amazing.
collector, and it was pretty great because I became known as this bug collector, and people would find amazing insects because of South Carolina. They're kind of
Yeah, 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 yeah.
yeah, and they're big there too. And they would bring them to me. So, I would meet people and they'd be like, "Oh, we found this moth or this
Yeah,
giant beetle or whatever." So it was really great.
for sure.
And so I was doing a lot of reading about bugs and ecology of insects and sort of conservation and that kind of thing. I finished up my first college degree, which is in studio art, and then I kind of just waitress. I was just sort of kicking it around back in those days. They didn't do any sort of training about like how you would make a living as an artist. Like they
Yeah,
just kind of presumed you wouldn't.
yeah.
So I took about 2 years off, and then I had taken a lot of classes in biology and anthropology as an undergrad.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah, because I was just really interested in that and working with people in those departments. And so I went back and finished those degrees very much with a focus on insects and entomology.
absolutely.
Yeah, and then I decided to do a master's in environmental studies at the College of Charleston,
For sure.
and was going to do it on beetles. I was in the process of getting funding for a project that would study ground beetles in the Smoky Mountains.
Wow.
Yes, and I was like, very excited to get to that stage, and was still very much, loved beetles and insects,
Absolutely, yeah.
that kind of thing. Yeah.
Mm,
But at the same time, I thought, an entomologist gets to go out and collect in the field maybe a couple of months
for
of the
sure.
year.
Yeah,
And then the rest of the time they're like counting foot segments, on
yeah,
a
yeah. I know what you mean.
and so I kind of shifted to more general environmental studies
For sure.
and with a policy focus,
Absolutely.
and ended up doing a project on sustainability, on campus sustainability. And then I applied for a PhD project that was in the Netherlands. And
Wow.
yeah, it was an amazing experience. I got that position, and I went and did my PhD in the Netherlands and focused on wetlands and wetland policy.
Okay.
So I've always had this sort of connection with policy. And when I
Yeah,
came back
yeah.
to the US, yeah, and environment and policy. When I came back to the US, I got a position at the university where I am now, the University of Hartford. But I'm embedded in a American government politics department.
For sure. Yeah.
So it's kind of weird for me because of all the
Yeah,
things I
yeah, yeah.
study, you
No, but
know.
like amazing story. And I think what you said there was also amazing, right? Because you went into college, right, being fascinated by insects, and then you still wanted to pursue the love of art. And I think one thing people don't talk about enough when talking about environmental science is, I mean, it's such an interdisciplinary field, right? You can bring in so many different types of subjects and find a way to create this advocacy. So I thought that was amazing. Can you
Mhm.
talk a little bit more about what caused you to view the art that you were talking about? What caused you to view that as, an avenue of advocacy to really spread awareness about what's happening to all sorts of species?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I love about art is it's kind of an underused tool
For sure.
to advocate. We think a lot about using the arts to advocate or to communicate with kids,
Yeah,
but then not always, for adults. And
absolutely.
the regular output for a scientist is journal articles,
Yeah, yeah,
or conference presentations. And for me, especially doing interdisciplinary work, that reaches such a limited audience.
yeah,
And I kind of got tired of just like spending so much time and energy on these publications that the only people who are reading them are really people who already know about the problem,
exactly.
already understand it, already want to change, want to do better. And so I see the arts as a way to communicate with a much broader audience, to share scientific information in ways that people can understand it maybe a little bit differently, and
Absolutely.
then try to build up like care for the animals and the environment so that we can have policy change.
For sure. And I know just reading a bit about the art you were doing, a lot of it had focused on plastic pollution and creating more awareness on that front. So can you maybe talk a little bit more about the problem of plastic pollution, and do you see any sort of measures we can take to prevent it? I know increasingly we're seeing more regulations around, eliminating plastic straws or finding ways to, bring your own thermos, and all of which will help not have that sort of contribution in the oceans affecting the marine species. But can you talk a little bit more about the problem, and maybe what the ordinary person on an everyday basis can do to address that?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people are aware of the problem now. It's gotten a lot of coverage.
For sure.
And I feel like people know it's an issue and most of them want to do better, but they don't really know how.
Yeah.
Um, but when you think of it just as sort of an environmental problem, it impacts the environment and the species that live in the environment as it breaks down. And, they find plastic all over the world, from the fjords, like in the north
Yeah.
of Norway, to the top of the Alps, because of
Yeah.
the, water system,
For sure.
it's everywhere now. Trenches at the bottom of the ocean, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, so I think like, it really harms these important resources like soil and water, the world's oceans. I've been focusing on the impact it has on different animal species because I think people can really connect with animals, and care about them a lot.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and when I think about, like, giving people advice about what to do, I think it's like a lot of problems, like, climate change also,
Yeah.
it can feel so overwhelming that sometimes you think, "Well, nothing I do matters," because it's
Yeah. Yeah.
such a big problem.
For sure.
But I do think everything we do matters, and I think that we shouldn't kind of get caught up in the idea that you have to be perfect, to do a good job. So, like, I just tell people, if you can reduce the amount of plastic you use, especially single-use plastics,
Yeah.
then that's a win.
For sure.
Um, but a lot of things, are not designed to be recycled. They have no chance of ever really being
Yeah.
recycled. So what we can do to try to influence policy and communicate to leaders that we want something different, I think is really valuable. And I don't know if your audience is primarily young people, but I have found that young people have like a really powerful voice when advocating with
Yeah.
politicians, because they see someone like me and they kind of like know my whole thing. They know what I want.
Yeah. Yeah.
But they want young votes. They want young people. They want to hear what young people think and care about.
And I think what you were saying there at the end is so important, right? Because I think, like you were saying, on a daily basis, people view the problem and they're like, how can I, as just one person among the billions and billions of people, have any impact, right? And so can you maybe talk about just like a few solutions, like bringing your own thermos in, or just other solutions like that, which are, everyday basis when you're going to buy a coffee, bring in your own thermos, or just simple solutions that like that, that don't require a lot of effort as such and really can be done on a daily basis.
Yeah, that's a great one. Bringing your own cup to places, even to get coffee and places like that. A lot of those retailers will sell you a cup and let you bring that cup
Yeah,
back.
yeah,
Some of that was paused during COVID, but a lot of
yeah,
that's
yeah.
back again. I think we can really use social media too to sort of, I don't like to shame people who are doing badly, but I like more to kind of like amplify
Positive,
people who are
yeah,
doing it right. Yeah.
yeah,
So if I come across a company that's doing really great things in terms of packaging or
absolutely.
thinking about waste, then I try to highlight the work we're doing. I heard a really good one recently, which was for people who maybe don't have, the money to buy all kinds of, alternatives to plastic. And it was that you can choose to wash your clothes less frequently. Um,
Wow. Yeah.
and I have 3 kids, so like maybe not every item of clothing,
Yeah.
but some things, we try to explain to my daughter, like, if your jeans, if you've just worn them once and maybe not even for the whole day, like, wait and wear them again.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So we can make choices like that because one of the biggest areas of growth for plastic pollution is in fibers, coming
Wow.
from washing machines and dryers and going back out into waterways and airways.
Mhm.
So that's a really valuable one that you can do on any budget, you know?
Sure, yeah. So I think altering that mindset, like you said, there is so important. And I think what you were saying with the washing machines, right? That actually helps you save money in terms of not using the washer as much. And I think a common sort of sentiment around sustainability is that it requires so much more expense, like going for the electric car or going to purchase solar panels. The initial installation can be difficult. So do you sort of like envision a way for us to sort of change that narrative, like bring about the simple changes you were talking about, like the washing machine, and not necessarily focus too much on the expensive changes that we're seeing everyone talk about.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And what's interesting is that, I think like that information is out there and there are a lot of people who understand it and then can implement it.
Sure,
But
yeah.
when you think about like big governmental policy change,
Mm.
they don't know how to promote like not doing
Yeah.
something, like doing less, having, less with more, more with less.
Yeah.
They want to do a big expensive program, or they want to offer things like rebates on things. But there are sort of movements around that, especially in Europe that I've seen where people are kind of saying like, we might actually be happier if we kind of slow down. The
Mhm.
slow food movement is a great example of that. We might be healthier, we might be happier, we might have stronger and more resilient communities if
Mhm.
we are just kind of simplify things. I don't think anybody wants to sort of live in a hut with
Yeah,
no amenities.
for sure.
And I don't think that, that's maybe the solution, living with that is the
Absolutely.
solution for everybody.
Mhm.
But I think we can all think of things that might work for us that could mean, avoiding this or avoiding that just to save on single-use plastics or have a softer impact on the environment.
Yeah, and just to go off what you were saying there, right? I think today a lot of what we're seeing in terms of plastic reusability is after we use a product, it has like a one-time life cycle, right? So we use it, we discard it, we dispose it, and then we don't think about it. But I
Mhm.
think one sort of idea that's been around for a while, but I think is slowly getting more traction is this idea of a circular economy, right? Where right after you create a product, you find a way or manufacture it in a way such that after it's used once, you can regenerate it and redistribute it throughout society, right? So essentially, you're
Yeah.
extending the life cycle. And I think a lot of it doesn't have to be such big or deep solutions. Like even when you think about a shoe today, right? When you see it has a hole in it, the first sort of thought process is I'm going to throw it away, maybe
Yeah.
donate it. But it doesn't need to be like that, right? If we have these sort of repair shops or these retailers that take that hold up shoe and maybe stitch it back up together, then you have a brand new shoe. It could end up from landfill to human, right? So essentially, you're eliminating the idea of a shoe, which
Mhm.
doesn't really decompose well. You're eliminating it from getting into the landfill. And so, do you sort of see this idea of circular economy as being something of the future, or do you think it's an idea that maybe needs more support? Because obviously, to go from linear to circular, you do need incentivization, right? So how do we get everyone to really be on board with this movement?
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful idea. And what I love about it, right? Because this is kind of like a full circle
Yeah.
thing, is that requires to to either reuse things
So,
or to design things, that requires creativity and that like produces jobs. If we could like get people thinking about how do
absolutely.
you really design these
Yeah,
things,
exactly.
to have a further life, a longer life. Um, I think that's like could make for such a vibrant economy.
Mhm.
And I do think that there's a lot of potential for reusing things. I think it's an idea whose time has come, and I hope that it will kind of grow over time. I do see it more and more. We have reuse cafes or refurbishment cafes in our part of Connecticut, and so I think there's a lot of potential for that growth, but in some places, I don't think it's on the radar at all.
Yeah. Yeah. No, so I really do think, right, in some places maybe we can, in some places maybe not. But I think with an idea like that that requires so many people, it sometimes can be hard. And I think a sort of common sentiment today is I'm in California, you're in, I think, Connecticut, right? And so
Yeah.
when we see like the sun shining, people are like, we have the California sun, we have the Connecticut sun, like climate change seems a thing of the distant future. And
Mhm.
so people don't sort of think about, maybe the farmers or the people who do have a real world impact. And the thing is, like, farmers are the ones who are providing us with crops. And so indirectly, it is very much affecting us, right? And so can you talk a little bit more about how do we sort of like change that, I guess, maybe attitude? And it's similar to what we were talking about with like the plastic pollution, right? I think with the Great Pacific Garbage Patch too, like many people see the top of the ocean, the blue ocean, and they're like this is not a problem we have to worry about. But beneath the ocean where people don't go, they don't see the real
Mhm.
world impact, like on the turtles, on the marine species.
Mhm.
And so I feel like so much of it maybe does revolve around policy making, but do you think it's possible to sort of like alter that mindset that we're seeing so prominently, I guess, displayed?
Yeah, and I think, over the last like 20 years, it's more and more in the background, and I think in a way that people can't ignore. When you think about climate change, I mean, you could read a newspaper in I think any part of the country any week and find several stories that are
Absolutely, yeah.
absolutely connected to climate change, but they're not always framed that way
Mhm.
because locally, politically, it might be seen as this sort of hot button issue that people have all sort of ideas about, maybe negative ideas about. I just went to visit family in the deep south in Georgia, in the southern part of Georgia, and all they could talk about were these different storms they've been having
Yeah.
lately and how bad the storms have been, and I know that they don't they don't think climate change is real, some of my family members, and I've told my mom before, "Ask your insurance guy. Ask him what he thinks about climate change,"
Yeah. Yeah.
because there are some industries where it's undeniable.
Right.
And I wish that the people who were involved in those would sort of depoliticize it because it's not really about politics. It's about getting to enjoy the lifestyle we hope to enjoy, for as long as possible. So I think it's more in the background. I do think more people are talking about these kinds of things. And I think I see it everywhere, and I don't see how anyone can deny it
Yeah.
anymore. But my project with plastic pollution, what I'm trying to do is kind of like help people connect to the kind of products that they use when they see those logos or that packaging, and sort of think about more about themselves.
Yeah. No, that makes so much sense. And I know you were talking about in the deep south of Georgia, we're seeing global warming. And I think an often maybe location that people sort of put at a distant thought is what's happening at the poles, when we're seeing in the Arctic, with all the melting ice. And so can
Mhm.
you talk a little bit more about why melting ice does have such a detrimental impact and why maybe looking at that as an origin or as a starting point is so crucial? Because I think people like similar sort of thinking is like it's such a far away problem, like who is actually going to the poles, who's actually going and visiting. And so it seems like a distant far away thought, and people don't really understand the gravity of the situation. So can you talk more about what we're seeing at the poles and like the genuine and true impact that it actually is creating?
And I should say, I'm not like my expertise is not in sort of like polar science. But in my limited exposure to what's happening in the poles, I got to go to the Arctic about this time last year on
Wow.
an expedition through National Geographic and Lindblad expeditions. And it was an incredible, I mean, it was such a special place and such a beautiful environment. And I think the biggest problem is we talk about with design things that are designed to be used for just an instant. We have such this like instantaneous sort of idea about our world,
Yeah.
but glaciers and the polar ice caps, were formed over many, 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 many years,
Yeah.
and we are using them up on a time scale that's completely different
Mhm.
from that under which they were formed, and we don't understand fully like all the implications that's going to have for our
Yeah.
environment, but the researchers who studied that have been warning us for decades that it could be irreversible, and it could change, the way we all experience, our world. And so it's critically important to protect those resources. We
Yeah.
can't remake them. We can't remake
Exactly.
an ice cap.
Absolutely. And I think maybe one solution that can be implemented is I feel it all really goes back to, legislation, government, and passing policies to curb fracking, to curb using these unnecessary glaciers and just have that sort of mindset when we're thinking about it. And I think when you look at the history of legislation or climate legislation, right, we have the Montreal Protocol, Kyoto Protocol, we have the Paris Accords. And I think maybe an ambitious goal in the Paris Accords was we have to go net zero by 2050, 2060. And so do you think that many of these countries are actually on track to do that? Because I know when we were talking about the Montreal Protocol, it was about like chlorofluorocarbons and like the ozone hole. And people were able to see and visualize it. Oh, it's a hole, it's harming our earth. And so they're able to get it, right? But
Mhm,
maybe with the Paris Accords and maybe with the current climate situation, like CO2, you can't see it, right? It's like
mhm,
colorless. And
mhm,
so they're not able to see that impact. And so
mhm.
do you think that that policy making that we're seeing in the UN, that we're seeing in the Paris Accords, do you think we're on track to meet that? And if so, like what can we do about it?
I don't think we're on track right now, but I do think there are a lot of people who are deeply concerned about it. It's really interesting to me that you bring up the Montreal Protocol, because that in my environmental policy classes, we use that as an example of kind of the last time that um, uh, governments and intergovernmental groups uh, took the advice of scientists and then immediately implemented it and then solved the problem. And
Mhm.
it's sort of a famous example in environmental policy textbooks of the fact that industry recognized that and said, we are never going to let scientists define a problem, an environmental problem, again, if it's going to hurt industry.
Yeah,
And so after that, that success with the carbofluorocarbons,
for sure. That's
chlorofluorocarbons,
the
sorry.
confusing. Yeah.
It is the middle of the summer. After that success, they didn't allow sort of scientists to set the stage any longer and define problems in the same way, and instead actively pushed back against that.
Yeah.
And so I think that that is absolutely a problem with plastics, and it continues to be a problem with climate change. We have allowed, or I don't even know if we have allowed it, because I think many people who care about this issue don't want industry, the people who are profiting from this, to define how we deal with it. Because obviously they have a stake in it, and it's a stake to make more profits, not to protect the environment or be sustainable overall. Yeah, so I think it's going to continue to be a struggle to get on track with climate legislation. But I also believe that policy is often incremental. It often moves in small steps. And there can be moments where big things happen and it really changes the way
Absolutely.
thousands or millions of people think about a problem and then
Yeah.
leads to change. So um, I'm very hopeful. I'm a glass is half full kind of person.
Wow. No, it's great to hear from someone like that. I know so many people, when they're thinking about it, they're like, we're already in a state where, it's irreversible, right? And we can't undo the harm. And so obviously that perspective is not the most like, optimistic. You want to hear that there is a way out. And maybe I think there is a way out,
Mhm,
if we're able to get millions of people on board, like you were saying. And
mhm,
I feel like in order to see the success that we did with Montreal, right, we need to see sort of inter-country collaboration, right, with developing countries and developed countries, right, both working together. And I think oftentimes countries like the United States, they are responsible for so much of the emissions. I think like the global north is responsible for like over 90% of the emissions, but the global south is responsible for like almost 1%. So like the difference is really crazy. But
Yeah.
even then we're not seeing the global north reducing their emissions to the extent that they need to, and the global south, they're barely contributing, but yet they're oftentimes the recipients of the worst effects of
Absolutely.
climate change. And so do you think like maybe the more developed countries, do you think there is potential collaboration with developing countries, or are we continuously going to see this grab for monetary gain for a country by country basis, and will we not see these relationships pan out in the future?
I think inter-country collaboration is the key, and I think it's so important. And I'm fortunate through National Geographic to have had the opportunity to collaborate with researchers in India, in Kerala, India, and in Uganda, and in
Oh,
where's the other? Indonesia.
yeah.
Um, yeah, and we're trying
Yes.
to work together to do more of that. But yeah, it's incredibly well, I think it's still the vestiges of colonialism that we continue to the global north continues to profit, the global south continues to be behind. And in terms of climate change, sometimes it's global corporations that are um, headquartered in the developed countries
Yeah.
that are selling products to the global south that they know are going to fill their waterways, and those one-time plastics, single-use plastics. So I do think that collaboration is possible. I think it's necessary, but I do think that like greed is so powerful, and I see it on the micro to the macro scale kind of all around me, and it's hard to understand why people act the way they do, and how they can be I mean, because I don't think it makes people happy. In my experience, it doesn't seem to make people very happy, but it is sort of the impulse that a lot of people have.
Yeah.
So that's kind of more about like that slower movement, or that getting back to basics, movement, people recognizing when they're happy, when they're unhappy, and what things can make them happier, which I think for a lot of people is spending times with, friends and family, having more time, working less, that kind of thing.
For
Yeah.
sure. And I think he had also talked about how we're seeing the sense of greed. And one quote that came to mind is like, if 15 people in the world, they could easily sort of incorporate the bottom 50% of the entire world today, like their wealth is equivalent to that. So I think
Yeah.
that's sort of like a testament to what you were saying there. And I think you also mentioned this word colonialism, right? And I think when we're even just looking the creation of this country, the creation of so many countries, we
Mhm.
see Western settlers, European settlers coming into the country and oftentimes pushing away indigenous peoples off their land. And I
Mhm.
think maybe a group that hasn't been talked about enough are the indigenous peoples and the struggles that they go through, really because of this emanating sense of colonialism. And
Mhm.
so, can you talk about maybe what you've really sort of seen in that aspect, are sort of these marginalized groups that no one is talking about, where land is really their home, and the struggles that they're going through on a daily basis because of our actions?
Yeah, I mean, it happens all over the world, in every country. I think there are people who are displaced and who lack access and sort of an ability to get out of maybe the lowest rungs in terms of socioeconomic problems. We see it in the United States, of course, and it's happening all over the world. I think in the last sort of like 4 or 5 years, kind of through the COVID pandemic and Black Lives Matter in the United States and these kind of things, there's been a little bit more of a recognition of how important those voices are. And I know, for example, with National Geographic, they have made a concerted effort to fight against colonial science or parachute science. There's this really famous National Geographic explorer named Asha DeVos, who's Sri Lankan, and she's a whale biologist. She's amazing. And she's done a lot of writing about parachute science or colonial science. And so now when you're applying for a grant, they want you, as they should, they want you to talk about, you know, what are you, because the idea of parachute science, right, is you come in, you take all the knowledge and you leave with it.
Yeah.
And then you go and publish all these papers and get more esteem and recognition.
Um,
And the people who might have actually been even like collecting the data for you,
yeah.
let alone like welcoming you into their community, get no recognition and no benefits. And so now when you apply for grants, they really want to know that you have to demonstrate how you're leaving behind
Yeah.
knowledge, resources, tools, how you're collaborating with local communities, how you are choosing to interact with local communities.
For sure.
Um, and the ideal is that you're actually partnering with local communities to do a project that they want. That's
Yeah.
kind of like the final straw, because there's lots of people who partner with local people,
Yeah.
but doing the project
Yeah.
the person from the US or Europe wants to do. So I think a huge breakthrough is now they're saying, why does this community want this research? How does this research benefit this community? And how are you going to ensure that they're reaping all the benefits that you're reaping when you go to study there? So I've seen a lot of changes in that, but it's still, I think, a long way to go. And of course, someone who's actually a person on the ground in one of those communities would be the person to say whether these kinds of measures are effective or not,
Yeah.
whether it's really getting at the problem.
Yeah, and I think that word you mentioned there was so on point, like parachute science, right? I think that really is a trend we're seeing where we take the knowledge, but then we sort of exploit it in a way, use it for our own needs rather than other people. And I think sort of talking about on this topic of displacement and what we're seeing today, I think maybe the modern day version of colonialism that we're seeing is this notion of, climate refugees, really all over the world where due to global warming, they're being forced to sort of leave.
Mhm.
And in that, for no fault of their own, right? They're displaced, they don't really have proper amenities, places to live. And so how do we sort of go about fixing that problem? Do you think setting up, shelters, providing aid? I mean, with a problem that's likely to get worse like this, and with really the need of big corporations, governments working together,
Mhm.
how do we sort of see that problem play out? Do you think these climate refugees will be able to find new homes, find new jobs, find new ways to adapt? Yeah.
I mean, it that could be the defining problem of the next century. I mean, I think right now when we think about refugees, we're thinking about a lot of other kinds of refugees, a lot of people who are displaced because of war or things that are happening in their countries, um, either like dictatorships or all kinds of other things that are happening. Um, so that's when I think refugees right now, that's sort of like what's filling my head.
Yeah.
But absolutely, climate refugees are something we're gonna have to deal with more and have to think about. And what's so crazy about it is that it's preventable, like we can make choices now that could prevent climate refugees in the future. But I don't sort of like want to badmouth politicians. Well, they can take it, I think, actually. But politicians, it's very difficult to get a politician to commit to something where
Yeah.
the benefits are going to be seen in 20 years because they want to be reelected in the US system in 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, depending on whether they're a state rep, a president, or a senator.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they just want, quick and easy fixes, and to spend money on something that could save billions of dollars and millions of lives in the future for whatever reasons is a hard sell.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really mind-boggling because we could do so much more, and we could make choices that could save, my grandchildren, your grandchildren, maybe so much anxiety and pain.
I
But
think, yeah, yeah, no, and like the problem of climate refugees, it is so sad, and you think about how you can help them, and like you were saying, it's just so hard to come to this consensus and solution, in the sort of political society that we're living in today. I
mhm,
guess, like maybe just a few more questions.
mhm,
Can you maybe talk about, I think, like we're seeing, continuing on the topic of, policy, right? A lot of policy today revolves around CO2 and being able to reduce our CO2 emissions, reach net zero, like we were talking about before. But even if we do reach net zero, right, at the pace that we have been emitting, there is still so much CO2 in the atmosphere, right? And so what do we do about that? Like, let's say, some day down the line that we are able to have this intergenerational, intercountry collaboration, we're able to reach net zero, right? That's amazing. But
Mhm.
we still do have so much CO2 in the atmosphere. And so do you think that'll hold out to be a problem? Do you think there'll be ways to like remove it? Like,
Mhm.
what do you sort of see on that front?
Yeah, I am not an expert in sort of like carbon removal and sequestration technology, but I know that that's a really active and fertile area that a lot of people are researching because of different networks I'm a part of. I see emails and listserv messages about different things, even outside of my own field. So I mean, I think for me, what I hope is that, like you say, we use that after we've gotten to net zero to reduce the amount of carbon in the air. To my mind, the sort of worst case scenario is that we just try to limp along and reduce our carbon with technological fixes that don't get at the root issue, and still kind of leave us with a huge amount of carbon in the atmosphere. So I think there's a lot of potential there. And I also think, like we are creative people. There's a lot to be said for ingenuity, and
Absolutely.
we can solve problems if we recognize their problems and we work towards solving them. I'd love to see us just having the luxury of putting our energy towards getting rid of the excess carbon in the atmosphere. So
Yeah.
maybe dream that.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. I know you're talking about creativity. I know one of your main forms of advocacy is art. So maybe to close up, can you talk a bit about what are those forms of art that people can pursue? I know you were talking about, stitching together pieces. I saw how you created like the outlines of those birds and then cut out the plastic pieces to create those amazing sort of marine species. And so how do people sort of get involved and really create that? I know it's really just the small changes that make a difference. I saw like if you hang up those posters, I saw you had done at some airports. It is
Yeah.
amazing. But when people see that, they're like, oh wow. I mean, they take a step back. And so how do we sort of convey that sentiment through art? How do we get other people to pursue art and combine it with sustainability like you have done?
Yeah, thank you. I think, what's so powerful about art is the way it can stick with us and make us think about something in a new way. And that was kind of my goal with the Entangled and Ingested project.
Yeah.
I'd been studying plastic and plastic pollution, and I'd been kind of experimenting with sewing plastic, and it really all came together when I decided to make these life-size portraits of different animals that are harmed by plastic pollution. And that's just one way, to sort of connect the arts with plastic or other environmental issues. And there's so many amazing things
Yeah.
happening around the world where people are doing. I've worked with this group in Kenya, led by a guy named Dave OJ, and they take flip-flops that have been used and they
Yeah.
basically like press them together
Uh,
and glue them together so that you almost make like boards out of them.
yeah.
And then they built a boat
Yeah.
from those and
Wow.
sailed it on Lake Victoria to talk about this issue, to go to
Yeah.
different communities and talk
Amazing.
about this issue. So like there is some really cool stuff that's happening
Yeah.
around the world. And I think those kinds of things where you can connect people with something beautiful or something
Yeah.
interesting, you really leave an impression that you can't leave through a scientific paper.
Absolutely. And I think you were talking about, I know just one more thing, you were talking about the slippers there. That sort of brought to mind the idea of fast fashion, right? And how people can
Mm,
use, yeah, like they're using clothes, like they're using art as a way to really convert that. I think I was just seeing recently, I think in South America, they had like sort of this model show where people were just using clothes in the landfills and then just creating a show out of that. And so I
so
think
cool.
fast fashion would be something similar to art, right? In that sense, like,
Yeah, absolutely. That's a definitely like a different outlet for it. We have a group in Middletown. that just led something called a trash and fashion show,
Wow.
and they worked with people over several months,
Mm.
and got it's called the Free Center in Middletown. They got people to, because you can have a desire to do that, but no sewing skills,
Yeah,
and then you don't have much. But like taught them some sewing skills, had some really skilled seamstresses come in and assist them, and they held a fashion show where they were remaking things.
yeah,
So I think I've seen a lot of that lately. That just might be my like
yeah. No, no, me
Instagram
too.
feed, but I think there's so much potential there, and you can actually end up with pieces that you love and that fit you better and are more
Yeah,
flattering, and more
absolutely.
comfortable because you've customized them in a way. Yeah.
Awesome. That's awesome. I guess the last question is, what advice do you sort of have to aspiring environmentalists? How do they get into the field and sort of create the dent and impact that you've done in terms of plastic pollution, creating that advocacy, working with different groups, organizations, corporations? Like, where do they start? I know at the beginning you were talking about how climate change is such a big problem. And
Mhm.
I think another sort of aspect about it is there's this sense of togetherness as well, right? It is one of the only problems we have today that can unite everyone because, this
Mm.
is our planet. And so what do you sort of say to to people who want to get to a position like you and make an impact that you've done? How do they do so? And where do they really start?
Yeah. Well, I would say, if you had told me 30 years ago that I would be able to do something that actually involved the art degree, the social science degree, and the natural science degrees that I had, I
Yeah.
wouldn't have believed you,
Yeah,
and I think like it's what makes my work exciting to me is the fact that I get to incorporate all these different things that make me really
absolutely.
happy and that I'm really passionate about. And so I think we have such an emphasis on STEM, and STEM is great, but
Yeah,
I would encourage people to also think about what you bring to any questions or things that you want to investigate, that make it unique and interesting, because that passion that you have about these things is going to
for sure.
fuel you and going to help you come up with like really creative ideas.
Absolutely. That's incredible. Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Owens, for joining us on this podcast. I know we talked about variety of different topics and fields, but it was just amazing to get your expertise and knowledge. I think on so many different ideas, not only within the sciences, but then also combining that with the culture and tying that in with climate. So really amazing. Thank you so much to our audience. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, and we'll see you on the next episode of Earth Day Every Day. Thank you so much.